Okay friends, one of the first things we need to do is safely raise and support the truck by the frame so the suspension's hanging. After that, we're going to remove our 6 lug nuts and get the wheel off of here. Now following the knuckle up, we're going to go ahead and remove these 2 mounting bolts here that holds your brake hose and the ABS wire. Now we're going to remove our caliper bracket bolts. Oops. Go ahead and grab onto that caliper. We'll take it off of there, and then we need to safely hang it so it's not putting any pressure on the flex hose. Let's get the rotor off of here. Now we're going to remove the axle nut center cover. That exposes the nut. Go ahead and remove that. Now put that nut back on a couple threads. Essentially what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to push the axle so that it's coming out of the hub here, and then we can move along. Now we're going to follow this ABS wire and we're going to unsecure it from its mounting points. Grab your little forky tool, come right up along here, pop that out of there. Right up here. Now if you follow this up, it's going to come up along to right here. When you pull this down, you're going to see there's a little squeeze tab. Go ahead and squeeze on that and then separate the 2 parts. Double check to make sure you don't see any corrosion. Assuming it looks good, let's set it aside. From the back side of the knuckle, you're going to see your vacuum lines. Go ahead and grab onto those, break them free. Take those right off there. Next, it's going to be time to get our outer tie rod end out of our knuckle. Go ahead and remove your cotter pin, remove the nut, and then we're going to break this free and get the tie rod out. Now let's do the same thing to the upper, hopefully. Let's just start that nut back on a couple threads. Now let's do the same to the lower ball joint. Let's leave that on a couple threads. Now let's come back up to the top here. We'll go ahead and pull down on this, get the nut out of there. Slowly let this down, make sure that your axle is making its way out of the wheel bearing as we can continue. Now with this leaning down at an angle, with the axle definitely coming out of the wheel bearing, we're going to continue on to hitting right here with our hammer to try to break the lower ball joint free. Once that's broken free, go ahead and lift up on it, remove the lower ball joint nut, and then remove the knuckle. Take the axle, put it right up here. Now the next thing we're going to do is remove the sway bar link from the lower control arm. Typically there's going to be a nut of some sort up here. You can hold on to the sway bar link stud, and then from underneath you'll find the nut. Let's go ahead and spray these down with some penetrant. You want to make sure you spray down both sides of the vehicle because we're going to be dropping this sway bar down so we have access to the mounting nut for the lower control arm. At this point you can move this all around. Let's go ahead and loosen up the other side as well. Now we're just going to go ahead and push these up. Set that aside. Next we're going to move along to removing the bolt that holds the front strut to the lower control arm. Let's leave that bolt right in there for now. Now we're going to start loosening up our lower control arm to the frame mounting bolts. Let's hold one side with the wrench, come over on the other side and remove the nut. Now let's go ahead and remove the rearward bolt as well. All right, let's remove both of our bolts. Now we're just going to carefully hold up on our control arm, remove this bolt, and get our control arm out of here. So now before we go ahead and install our control arm, I just wanted to go over one thing. We're going to be replacing the bolts with some that have cams on them. This is going to be an adjustment point for an alignment. As you can tell, our original bolts did not have that. The reason why I'm mentioning this to you though is because these bolts are going to have to go in from the opposite direction than when we originally took out the originals. With that said, let's go ahead and coat our bolts, whether they're old or new. Along this area right here, that's the area that's going to go into the bushings and it's going to make it so they come out much easier down the road. All right friends, now it's going to be time to install our brand new control arm. To do this, I'm going to go ahead and lift it up straight along here, and I'm just going to go ahead and start in this bolt first so I have something that's holding the control arm for me. There we are. At this point, you want to be very careful not to let this swing down and potentially hit you, but aside from that, let's go ahead and start in our other two bolts. Now, when it comes time to installing your two bolts, you're going to have one that's longer than the other. The one that's longer is going to go for the front. Like I said, I have the kit that has the adjustment bolts, so I'm going to go ahead and put this so it's lined up with the hole right there. Slide this through the control arm, line everything up, and then go ahead and put this the rest of the way through. So now we're just going to set this cam so it's facing pretty much straight up. You definitely don't want it facing down because then it's going to get caught on this ridge right here. Now we'll just go ahead and do the same thing to the rear. Got my little adjustment point here that goes into its slot. And I'll put this through. Once again, I'm using cam bolts that have the adjusters to them. If you're not using these particular types of bolts with the adjusters, you want to go from the inside with the bolts coming out and put your nuts on the outside. So now it's going to be time to put our nuts back onto our bolts. If, of course, you're not replacing your nuts with brand new ones, you want to make sure that you have at least a decent amount of red thread locker on them. I like to use new nuts and red thread locker, so you can do what you want. Okay, so now that we have all three of our mounting nuts started, we're going to continue on by putting the knuckle and everything else back together. And then once this is down on the ground, that'll be when we tighten everything up completely. Okay, so now we have all three of our mounting nuts started. We need to continue on by putting the rest of the front end. We need to continue on by putting the rest of the front end back together and get this on the ground before we continue on tightening all these up. Now let's get our sway bar link back into the control arm here. Go ahead and get our sway bar back onto here. Now let's go ahead and torque these to 41 foot-pounds. Do the same thing to the other side. Now let's torque our sway bar link to 59 foot-pounds. Okay friends, now it's time to get our knuckle up on here. We're going to want to make sure we have our lower ball joint nut in hand, because essentially what we're going to do is bring the knuckle up, start this shaft into the wheel bearing, and then we're going to go ahead and put this stud down into the bottom of the knuckle and start the nut. There we are, get that nut on there. Okay, now we can release this. Now let's go ahead and get our bar up inside here for some leverage. We're going to push the knuckle up, make sure that the axle is coming through the wheel bearing right here. Use your leverage and pull down on that upper ball joint control arm there. Let's go ahead and start on our nut. We'll bottom it out and then we'll torque it to 85 foot-pounds. Now let's go ahead and torque this to 85 foot-pounds. Once you have that torqued, you need to continue on by checking to see where your slotted end of your nut is compared to the stud hole that's on your ball joint. You want to make sure that those two are lined up because that's where the locking cotter pin is going to go through. If for some reason it's not lined up, you need to continue tightening until the very next slot is. and peen down that locking cotter pin. Now let's go ahead and tighten up that lower ball joint nut. Now let's go ahead and torque that to 111 foot-pounds. The next thing you want to do is clean up the mating surface between your hub right here and your brake rotor. And then after you do that, just go ahead and coat it with some copper never sees. With those surfaces cleaned and prepped, let's go ahead and put the rotor on here. Now I'll just take a spacer and I'll use my lug nut here, and I'm going to hold this on there so it holds the rotor to the hub. Now let's go ahead and get our caliper back on here. Once we get it on, we'll start our bolts, we'll bottom them out, and then we're going to torque them to 184 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and get this mounted back on here. Now let's put a little bit of copper never sees on these bolt holes. Let's get the flex hose remounted. Let's go ahead and get our ABS wire in here. When you install this, you want to make sure you have it facing down. That way there it can meet in right here. Let's take care of this ABS wire. It's going to go up and in between this brake line area here. It's going to come right up here. Make sure you reconnect in all of your mounting points. Okay. There we are. Make sure that's completely clipped in. If it's not, you're going to have an ABS light. You got your little prongs. Those are going to match up right up along here on the inside. Make sure it's completely secured and there's no way that it's hanging around and can get damaged in any way. There we are. Now that that's started, let's go ahead and snug this up and we'll torque it to 85 foot-pounds. Something to pay attention to is this nut is also a slotted nut, so you need to make sure it lines up with that hole. Once again, if it's not, just keep tightening until the next one does. Locking cotter pin. Now it's going to be time to get our axle nut back on there. You're going to notice that it's a very small axle stud and nut. The torque for this is only going to be 20 foot-pounds. Super important to make sure you put your cap back on. Double check to make sure it's not damaged in any way. If it looks like it's damaged, you can try to use a sealant or, of course, replace the cap. This one looks great, so I'm just going to line it up and pop it on there. Now that we have everything completely together, an exception of putting the wheel on here and, of course, torquing our 3 bolts that we haven't torqued or tightened yet, we need to continue on by raising and supporting the control arm so it's pretty much at ground ride level. Essentially what I mean by that is so that it's kind of acting as though the wheels are on the ground and the whole weight of the vehicle is on the suspension. Now obviously getting a torque wrench in here while you're working down on the ground is going to be much more difficult for you, so if you wanted to just use a jack underneath the control arm and lift it up so it's in that ride height position, that works as well. So we're going to start off by tightening the lower strut mounting bolt right here. This is a very large bolt and it's going to be torqued to 406 foot-pounds when we're done. Now if you're dealing with the type that does have the adjustment point for here, you want to make sure that you have this so it's lined up and it's centered. What I mean by that is I'm just going to go ahead and turn this so that it brings it so it's pretty much straight up, and then I'll continue on by snugging it up. Now we're just going to go ahead and snug this up and then we'll torque it to 258 foot-pounds. Now let's go ahead and hold that cam bolt so it can't turn and torque this. Do the same to the rear. Let's get this off of here and get the wheel back on. Start on all your lug nuts, bottom them out, put your wheel back down onto the ground so it's barely touching, and then torque it to 150 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, now all you have to do is get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop.